for those of you who just logged in, if you are in a space where you can share your camera, it's great to see the faces when we start to talk and when the discussions begin, but feel free to turn off the camera in the meantime, and we will mute you if we hear strange sounds coming in. So for anyone who has been around the IMC for a while, Riccardo shouldn't really need a lot of introduction. In a sense, he was IMC before the IMC became the IMC. Originally, Riccardo comes from Bologna. He trained as a semiotician, studying the rhetorics around Berlusconi's narratives in a very kind of interesting way. But from being a traditional Italian semiotician trained in the echo tradition, he transformed himself into being able to analyze basically any kind of complex data you could think of having to do with semantics or language or physiology or anything else that involves complicated time series. The current project, the Puzzle of Danish, is started out as a really crazy idea formulated by Morten Christensen and a few other people, where the idea was to say there's something strange about Danish that we will hear more about, this language that's just so really difficult to learn. And Morten and Riccardo and others came up with the idea to try to, in a sense, look at Danish not just from the inside as a wonderful language to speak, but treat it as a particular linguistic case of a language that seems to have ended up almost in a blind alley language-wise, and to compare it with Norwegian that it seems close to and yet quite different from. And it turned into a very both playful and rigorous project that explores what is it like to understand each other and what is it like to understand across and between languages. So Riccardo, please take us into the Puzzle of Danish.
Thank you. So yes, the idea is that we are exactly going to use Danish to sort of figure out in which ways language affects human cognition or can affect human cognition. And I should front load that this is really a team effort, which is spearheaded by our younger colleagues. Burakan, Iskanyan, Fabio Trecca, and Christina Didriksen are really the people who did most of the work, while we sat in the back seat and gave some wise words every now and then. And the people who are more senior are Morten Christiansen, Christian Thulin, Dorte Blases, Anna Soyen, and Christian Johansson. And what I'm going to talk about is that I'm going to first sketch how is Danish different, in which sense it might pose a puzzle, and what are the implications of Danish for, or the peculiarities of Danish for actually learning Danish. And here I'm going to focus on native learners. Which then provides the foundation to the actual Puzzle of Danish study, which is about what are the implications of the peculiarities of Danish to understand Danish in an online context, meaning as hearing Danish. And here I'll present two studies, one about the role of context in categorical perception of language, which has been spearheaded by Burakan. The second study is going to be in which way context actually affects the processing of sentences, and this has been spearheaded by Fabio. And then we're going to turn the problem around by saying that Danish is not just understood, it's actually spoken. Right? It's produced in social context. And we're going to see how context is actually produced in conversation in a project spearheaded by Christine. And then I'll end up by the usual question is, so what, right? What have we learned? What are the implications? What are the products that are coming out of this project? So first, what about Danish? Well, we know that Danish already since the Middle Ages has developed an unusual sound structure, which is characterized by pervasive phonetic reduction. The vowels outnumber the consonants. And according to who's counting, you can get up to 40 vocalic sounds. And there's about 16 uncontroversial full vowels, 13 of which actually have phonemically relevant length variant, meaning that if you change the length, the word that you're hearing changes. Consonants are reduced. Often they're weakened to vowels, like G's and D's are often very weakly pronounced or outright dropped. Right? Often endings of words are just dropped. And these sort of gives this impression of how to pronounce any Danish word, right? You can put any word you want there, and then you start by ignoring something at the beginning, make some funny mouth shape later, speak as if you're drunk for most of the words, say this part as fast as possible, and anyway, it's gonna sound always like, and ignore this part, and then swallow your tongue here, and smile and look confident, right? That's the Danish figure. And, or again, you know, these sort of memes where people are just going to say, not sure if he's speaking Danish or he's choking. Right? But what does this actually mean in the real world outside of the joke, right? So in Danish, we have long sequences of sonorous segments instead of what, for instance, I was used to by speaking Italian, like more canonical consonant vowels sequence. And this also means that syllables and word boundaries, the separation between words, are not explicitly marked. And in articulation, in pronunciation, it is estimated that about 25% of the syllables that you would otherwise spell are lost. They're not pronounced, right? So let's see what this means with an example. So this is a sentence, "Hogt oret," in Norwegian, which I cannot pronounce, but you can see the spectrogram of the sound produced, where there's dark areas which correspond to the vowels or sonorous parts of the word, of the speech, and clear white cuts, which are the consonants which are producing an easy segmentation of the word. On the contrary, this is how you would pronounce this very same sentence in Danish, which, by the way, means smoked trout, oil, where you just get the gray wall of Danish. There is basically very little information as to where you should parse and segment this wall of sound. Right? Is this unique across the world languages? That definitely is not, but it is a harder nut to crack perceptually, so it's harder to process perceptually than most languages which it otherwise is reasonable to compare Danish to. For instance, Swedish and Norwegian, which have, you know, similar roots, a similar history, and they also present all sort of balanced conditions on how the population is. So this led us to the Danish opacity hypothesis, or DOE, in which the overall opacity of the Danish sound structure might impede or challenge speech processing, for instance, segmentation. So to put it a bit more strongly, Danish challenges the very psycholinguistic processes that are responsible for the acquisition of vocabulary, grammar, etc. And it challenges, in a related way, the very psycholinguistic processes which are responsible to how we understand speech in real time. So if it's hard to segment, it's hard to process and it's hard to learn. That's the basic idea. So the next question to ask is, of course, are the kids okay? How are they doing with learning language? As you can see from the face of this little kid, well, being exposed to Danish might be a perplexing experience. And this part, I should mention, is based on a paper that Fabio just got accepted, called Danish as Window into Language Learning and Processing. There's been a lot of research on vocabulary acquisition, especially by Dora Blazes and her group, based on children between 8 and 30 months of age, where if you compare the words that children can understand across a wide variety of languages, you can see that Danish, the red line, is solidly at the very bottom of the language acquisition trajectory, with Swedish staying there until about 1 year of age and then catching up and speeding up compared to Danish, right? So for instance, in a revised follow-up studies, it has been estimated that Danish children at 15 months can understand a median vocabulary of 90 words, Swedish at the same age of 150 words, and Norwegians of 140 words, right? However, Danish kids catch up by the time they are 30 months, right? So if you're a Danish speaker, native speaker in the audience, don't despair, you're caught up at a certain point. These kind of difficulties can also be seen in inflectional morphology, meaning declining verbs, for instance, where if we look at how kids between 4 and 8 years of age in Danish, Icelandic, Norwegian, and Swedish are able to produce the simple past, we can see that Danish children up to 8 years of age are slightly less performing than all these other languages, right? In particular, they have most difficulties in conjugating verbs in the past tense, where the DE at the end is something that is often very, very reduced in actual pronunciation. Again, most of my Danish colleagues seems to be doing okay at this, so the kids are probably catching up. We don't have the data for that. It hasn't been tested on older children, but adult Danes do not have this issue. So are the kids okay? Well, we observe a delay in language acquisition, especially if we compare to Norwegian and Swedish, which should present the same kind of structure and vocabulary. And it's potentially related to the opacity of the speech signal, right? This kind of gray wall of Danish. And this is supported by a study, I don't have the time to go into the details, but in which Fabio presented different kids with sentences in which the phonetic reduction was very pronounced, like her er eben, here is the monkey, and sentences where it was not highly pronounced, like find Bunsen, find the teddy bear. And he was showing that kids have much more difficulties identifying reference and learning words when the phonetic reduction is pronounced. Right, but we've also seen that they seem to recover on all these aspects. So the next question is, if the kids recover, should we then expect adults to be okay at understanding Danish? And if you haven't seen this video, I highly recommend to take 10 minutes after the talk and watch this pretty funny Norwegian sketch about the Danish language called Cameloso. So how do adults understand Danish? We have seen that if children catch up in language acquisition, right, this might be due to different kind of mechanisms. So the first one is that they simply need more time and exposure. Right? They're using the same learning process, the same cognitive strategies as children learning other languages, but they just need a bit more time. An alternative is that they might be putting into place temporary compensatory learning strategies. Right? But once they've learned Danish, this doesn't leave a trace in the way in which they process Danish. It's just a question of learning how to parse this signal. And then everything else is the same as in Norwegian, let's say. Or we might have that children are developing more stable compensatory cognitive strategies, which is supported by the fact that Danish language doesn't get clearer as the speakers grow up. Right? The same kind of gray wall of Danish is what they're exposed to when they're kids, and it's what they're exposed to when they're adults. So it still needs to be parsed. And we might have, for instance, that when the speech signal is more opaque, there is an increased focus on additional sources of information, for instance, the context. Right? And this is where the Puzzle of Danish, funded by the Danish Council for Independent Research, comes in. We try exactly to test these hypotheses, that adults have lasting compensatory strategies to deal with the opaque signal. And we have a three-pronged approach. Right? We start with the hypothesis that Danish speakers rely less on the acoustic signal because it's more opaque and more on top-down information, pre-existing and contextual information. And we look at how these affects categorical perception in the first study and sentence processing in the second study. And then we'll see on how context is actually produced differently, potentially, by Danish speakers. We ran these three studies in Aarhus on about 160 Danish participants, and in Norway, in Bergen, on participants native speakers of Bokmål, Norwegian, and again, the different experiments involved about 160 Norwegian speakers. So, without further ado, we get into the first study, which is Context and Categorical Perception, spearheaded by Bjørken, which is available as a preprint at the link there. under the title Cross-Linguistic Differences in Categorical Perception. The basic idea is that the way that speech is produced, this speech is realized, is very variable, right? You could have the sound a, which could be pronounced e, and if it's in the right context, right, we ascribe it to the very same letter A, right? To the very same phoneme. This kind of phenomenon has been long studied in linguistics. There is a classic study from 1957 where they show that if you take the sound s and the sound t, and you manipulate it so that you produce all the intermediate step between the one sound and the other, and you get people to listen to this, and they have to decide whether it's S, S or T. As you manipulate it, you can see on the x-axis at step 1, where it's clearly S, everybody's saying it's S, 100% S preferences. As you move and continue to manipulate up to 3, you basically get no difference. People keep categorizing it as S. But as you move towards T, you get an abrupt change, where very quickly between 4 and 5, you get to a strong majority of T. The change in the acoustic signal has been minimal, but the change in the perception has been categorical. Right. This has been used already to investigate the role of context, for instance, by a very nice paper by Shostak and Pitt in 2013, where they looked at the continuum between S and Sh. Right. And what they did is they realized that we rarely hear phonemes in isolation, so we can put them into a context. We have the sip or ship was tasted, which should sort of prime you, we should give you information about this being a sip. And indeed, we see that in the plot, in the very nicely drawn red line to highlight the right part of the plot, there is a curve towards, like it pulls the decisions towards the top of the plot, meaning that it primes people to hear it more as s than sh. But if we do the opposite, we give a context in which ship is more likely, the ship or ship was traveling, we get the opposite effect. It's pulled towards the bottom, where people are more likely to say ship. The second manipulation that they did in this experiment, they also look at whether the distance of the context from the target word made a difference, and they have the ship or sip was not able to be tasted, which sounds a bit awkward, but that's what they used. And you can see that the effect is decreased. It's still there, but it's decreased distance. And the same for the ship or sip was unexpectedly traveling. So how do we, which kind of hypothesis about these phenomena can we draw from the Danish opacity hypothesis? Well, we know that Danish presents more ambiguous or opaque speech than Norwegian. So we might expect Danish speakers to be affected by the context more than Norwegian speakers, as generally a main effect. But also we might expect that if Danish is really that difficult to parse, a distant context will still affect Danish speakers more than Norwegian ones, right? So we will have an interaction effect between distance and language. We built a bunch of Scandinavian stimuli where the contrast was between sent and tent. We had near and far match conditions with sentences like hon har sent or tent in imponerende klar lampe. So she has sent or lit an impressively bright lamp. Or hon har sent or tent in imponerende she has sent or lit an impressively clear email. Participants were wearing their headphones, sitting in front of the computer, listening to these different sentences where the key target word would be modulated on the continuum between sent and tent, and they would have to, as soon as they can clearly hear one phoneme or the other, to choose whether it's sent or tent. Differently from the literature, we thought that not just the response, whether they went for tent or cent, would be informative, but also how long it takes to get there. I'm happy to take questions on this model, but the basic idea is that we assume that there is an evidence accumulation process where, as the participants are listening to the sound stimulus, they sort of move in this evidence space towards the top if they want to, if they're accumulating evidence for tent, or towards the bottom if they're accumulating evidence for cent. And as soon as they reach a certain level of confidence in their decision, they're going to push cent or tent. And we're interested in how fast this evidence accumulates in Danes and Norwegians as a function of where we are on the continuum between S and T, which context we're using, and distance. So, are Danish speakers more affected by context? Well, we see that Danish speakers and Norwegian speakers are both affected by context, and Danish is not affected more than Norwegians, but Danish is showing the same effect for near and far contexts. So you can see on the top part, it's Norwegian. The green density plot is showing how big an effect of context there is, how much the contextual primes are moving the choice. And you can see that the green one, which is for near context, is way bigger than the far one, which is the orange one for Norwegian, but they're actually the same for Danish. There is no difference between near and far. Can we get a better picture? Well, this is the kind of decision process that our model is inferring from the data that the different participants are producing. And it's quite clear that what is happening is that Norwegians are answering very fast. They're not accumulating evidence for long, while Danes are sort of being slower in figuring out what to decide. So what is going on? Well, we're seeing that Danish speakers are waiting longer before deciding, which allows them to use distant context as much as close context. We might also imagine that the wait might dilute the effect of close context. This could be due to a different cognitive ability, where Danish speakers might be better at maintaining relevant information in their working memory and therefore are less affected by distance, and they wait before deciding, while Norwegian ones, they would just forget the information, so they decide immediately. Right? Or we could add that this is simply a cognitive strategy. That is, that Danish speaker might just be used to wait longer before making a decision. They're accumulating information slower, while Norwegian ones don't bother waiting, but they could maintain the information if they actually waited. Right? It's simply, are they used to not wait and therefore they don't wait, or is it wouldn't matter if they waited? To figure that out, we ran a second experiment with new participants, and instead of answering as soon as they were sure about which phoneme they had heard, which word they had heard, they were forced to wait until the sentence was over. Right? So if it's a difference in cognitive ability, let's say working memory capacity, Norwegians would still not integrate the information in the same way. But if it's just a matter of choosing to wait, then Norwegian should behave more similar to Danes. Right, this was the plot from experiment 1. And if we look at experiment 2, we see that as we make Norwegians wait, the effect of the far context becomes basically indistinguishable from the effect of a near context. So they were simply not waiting. And when we look at Danes, well, something slightly puzzling, we can discuss in the question time if you want, is that what happens is that actually the far context becomes much more, much stronger in its contextual bias effect. So overview, what we see is that Danish speakers seem to be using a different cognitive strategy. And Danish speakers tend to wait longer before making phonological categorization decisions, which enables them to better integrate distant contextual information. But Norwegian speakers can be nudged into the same strategy as Danish speakers by forcing them to wait. Right? So it's not just a matter of capacity, it's a strategy. Now, we want to see whether these kind of phenomena can be observed also in a broader context. And we look at sentence processing, which is a project that has been spearheaded by Fabio and which is partly reported in the paper cited there. This is a sentence matching experiment where you're exposed to 4 different drawings of different possible interactions between the same 3 agents. And you hear a sentence that you have to match to the drawing. So for instance, the dog got bitten by the mailman, which would clearly point us to drawing number 2. However, this sentence is not in isolation, it's put in a context. For instance, we could have a little story surrounding that sentence. The dog was irritated that morning and had been for hours. When the mailman came with the mail, the situation became very tense. It didn't take long before the dog got bitten by the mail. The neighbor had seen this happen before. Here we have the setup of a context, which in a sense is not preparing us for the mailman biting the dog. On the opposite, we could have a congruent context where we have the mailman was irritated that morning and had been for hours. When the neighbor's dog came close to him, the situation became very tense. It didn't take long before the dog got bitten by the mailman. So what we do is that we manipulate 2 key elements of the context. The first one is semantic information, what we know of the word, information that is pre-existing the experiment. Where we have a situation like the dog was bitten by the mailman, it's kind of implausible in our experience of the word, where on the opposite, we have the mailman was bitten by the dog, which would be a much more plausible semantic content of the sentence. And we have pragmatic or contextual information in which we can have focus on the dog, which is irritated, which prepares us for the dog biting, and therefore it's incongruent with the sentence. Or we have the mailman, which is irritated, and therefore it's a pragmatic context, which is congruent with the sentence. You'll see also in some of the plots, there's also a manipulation about syntax, which I'm not going to talk about. So I'm just letting you know that it was there. So in this context, what are the Danish opacity hypotheses? We have that Danish speakers, we expect them to be more affected by contextual information than Norwegian speakers. And therefore, we expect them to make more errors when semantic and pragmatic information is not consistent with the sentence that they hear than Norwegian ones. But also, and perhaps more plausible, that they will be more attracted by drawings compatible with semantic and pragmatic context than Norwegian speakers. Even when answering correctly, they will consider the other drawings more. Right? And how do we measure that? Well, we used a couple of methods. Here I'm talking about the eye tracking analysis that we ran, where we divide the screen in 4 areas of interest, one of each of them corresponding to a different drawing. And we can look at how much participants are looking at the area of interest which is compatible with the pragmatic information, and how much they're looking at the area which is compatible with the pre-existing semantic knowledge. I can skip that. So, are Danes more affected by context? We measure these first in terms of errors. That is, we take their accuracy when the context is congruent with the sentence. Acting on that, the accuracy when it's incongruent with that. In a sense, we look at how much do the errors increase as the context becomes incongruent with the target sentence, or when the semantics is less plausible in the target sentence. And what we see here is that really the amount of errors due to pragmatic or semantic bias is not different between the two populations. In principle, we could even see a bit of a increase in errors in Norwegians when there is a semantic implausibility, but the individual variability is such that this difference is not credible. If we look at the eye tracking though, then we get a much clearer picture. We see that Danes, in red, tend to be way more attracted by drawings that are compatible with the pragmatic and semantic information than Norwegians are. So Danish speakers seem to rely more on the context than Norwegians. They look more at the drawings which are compatible with the pragmatic and semantic information, but not enough to make more mistakes. And again, we can ask the question, is this a difference in a fixed cognitive setup of how Danes process and Norwegians process the environment, or a more flexible difference in strategy, right? So can we make the Norwegians Danes again? So we have a second part of the experiment in which we introduce background noise in the recorded stimuli. And everybody hears all the stories, but half of the stories that participant 1 hears have background noise, and participant 2 will hear other stories with background noise. Just, I think it was brown noise, which disturbs a bit the processing of the stimulus. And we expect that by decreasing the quality of the acoustic signal, that is increasing opacity, Norwegian speakers will behave more like Danes, being more reliant on contextual information. So let's look at the errors. With noise, the biases are slightly increased, and Danish and Norwegians, so up on top, you can see the previous experiment. On the bottom, you can see what happens with noise. The difference between Danes and Norwegians disappears if it ever was there. But again, results are not so exciting. There is no credible difference. When we look at the eye tracking data, here was the plot from before, with Danes clearly on top of Norwegians in terms of pragmatic and semantic attraction. And when we include noise, what happens is that Norwegians, they even go slightly above Danes in the pragmatic attraction, and they become very close to Danes in the semantic attraction, right? Introducing opacity in the signal makes Norwegians more reliant on the context. So from this part, Danish speakers seem to weight context more than Norwegians at the sentence level and beyond. The differences seem to be grounded in different preferred cognitive strategies more than hard-coded. And Norwegian speakers, very important, can be made Danes again by making them wait before reacting and blasting continuous noise against them, which is very useful international politics information. However, this is sort of a niche situation in which we're just listening to speech being broadcast at us. Language processing is embedded often in larger dynamics, including production and conversations. Like, how do these strategies play out? How does this compensation play out in the way we actually produce language with each other? This is where Christina's PhD project comes in, which looks at context as something that we don't just are exposed to, but that we produce for each other. And there's a preprint coming out in a few days, and part of what I'm going to talk is in that proceedings down there. So what Christina has been doing has been investigating grounding mechanisms. What are those? Well, conversations are, at least before coronavirus, the most basic and common form of language use, the most basic and common form of social interaction, and they happen in and adjust to a wide variety of contexts. And I don't know, in my everyday life, mostly at dinner table while toddlers are screaming, or when you're discussing with the students, you are chatting with somebody who doesn't share a common information or background, and you need to sort of match the gaps in the understanding of the problem that you're trying to tackle. And Conversational are pretty good at bridging these gaps and coping with these challenges up to a certain point, also because they have multiple grounding mechanisms to build, monitor, repair common ground, common understanding. And I'm going to talk about 3 of them here: back channels, conversational repairs, and linguistic alignment. Back channels are a way of monitoring that everything is going on nicely. They're usually, at least in this study, a vocal token of understanding, like okay, yes, mm-hmm. Their agreement or confirmation, I agree, okay, just go on. And they're a sign that the conversation can continue, that it can just go on. There is a shared understanding that is being confirmed continuously. Repair is, in a sense, at the other end of the spectrum. It's stopping the conversational flow in order to make sure that there is no misunderstanding, and if there is a misunderstanding, to fix it. And it can be an open repair, just saying, huh? Like, I didn't get anything that you were saying. Or a more restricted kind of repair where you're asking for specific forms of information, like who or David. The last, and this was manually coded, the last mechanism that we investigate in this study is linguistic alignment, which is the propensity to reuse an interlocutor's linguistic forms. And we're going to talk about lexical choices, syntactic structure, and semantics, where we have things like, I don't know, child might say, look, a giraffe. And the parent might say, that is a tall giraffe. By reusing the word giraffe, right? Here we have a case of lexical alignment. But the alignment doesn't need to be at the level of lexical forms. We might have also something that we call syntactic alignment, where the words are not repeated, but the general structure is repeated. You have a child saying a tall giraffe, and the parent following up with, and a big elephant, where yes, A is repeated, but really the structure that is most saliently repeated is the article, adjective, noun, both in the first sentence and in the second sentence. Some people quibble with this being syntax. If you don't like it being syntax, you can just call it parts of speech sequence alignment. But there's a few studies showing that it's a very good proxy for syntax. The final form of alignment that we look at is semantic alignment, where a child, for instance, in this case, might say dog, 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 and the parents might say, yes, I hear it barking. There is no repetition of the same words, no repetition of the same parts of speech, but there is keeping on topic, remaining in the same semantic domain. All these forms of alignment, to lesser or stronger degree, have been associated with the development and maintenance of common ground and rapport in adult-adult conversation, but also, relevant to the first part of this talk, to language acquisition in children. Here I can actually go a bit fast, but the basic idea is that we analyze back channels and repairs using multi-level regression models. And to calculate alignment, we relied on a package, Python package called Align, which I developed with Nick Duran and Alex Paxton, which is a nice documentation and article that came out in Behavioral Research Methods a year ago, which automatize all these steps of identifying, of processing transcripts and calculating alignment. And lexical alignment is analyzed on a word-to-word base with lemmas, meaning dog and dogs are the same word. Syntactic alignment on 2, 3, and 4 element sequences of parts of speech tags. Semantic alignment uses word embeddings because Facebook has created semantic representation of Wikipedia in Danish and in Norwegians, which are comparable and therefore allows us to make the comparison between Danish and Norwegian conversations. And then, yeah, we use some multi-level 0 and 1 inflated beta location scale models. Doesn't really matter. This is the experimental setting. We have 2 people sitting close to each other in a room which is relatively silent. They go through 4 conversations. An affiliative conversation where they're just asked to discuss some common interests. They have a first task-oriented conversation, which is a joint decision-making where they have to go through space and meet aliens and figure out whether these aliens are dangerous or not. It's very symmetric. They have access to the same information. They go through a second task-oriented conversation, which is the map task, where one of the two people has to give instruction on how to reach a place on a map to the other, very asymmetric. And then finally, another affiliative conversation, which is important because these different kind of conversations have different demands on what is important to transfer. And so we want to see whether our effects were common across these different conversations. But these yielded 308 10 minutes conversation, about 100,000 utterances, which are all transcribed at word level and coded for back channels, repairs, and alignment. The Danish opacity hypothesis tells us that as Danish presents a more challenging sound structure, grounding mechanisms will be more needed to monitor continuous understanding, that's back channels, create a stronger and more redundant context, that's alignment, and repair misunderstandings, repair. And therefore, we expect Danish speakers to use more back channels, repairs, and alignment than Norwegian ones. And we might also expect that in task-oriented conversations where there is a higher need to more precisely understand each other, to see a bigger difference between Norwegians and Danes. Okay, if we look at back channels, what we see is that there is basically no difference between Danish and Norwegians. There are differences due to the kind of conversations people are having, but not to the language, and that back channels are about 20–30% of any utterance produced. Conversational repair, we actually see that Danish speakers use fewer repairs. We see that 1% of utterances are repairs in Danish, but 2 or 3% of utterances are repairs in Norwegian, and in the map task, this is actually much bigger, right? Which is against our predictions, but I'll have a post-hoc speculation as to why later. When we look at linguistic alignment, basically all 3 forms of alignments are showing a similar pattern. So I'm just going to sum them up in one slide. Danish displays more frequent and more extensive alignment. And the effect, the difference is bigger in task-oriented conversations. Curiously, what we see is that the linguistic alignment effects are not just me aligning, let's say, with Andreas, but it's also me aligning with myself, like presenting more redundant utterances as I keep on speaking, continuously referring to the past. And these 2 effects are partially overlapping, but they're solid and robust on their own. So what we see is that Danish speakers align more than Norwegians, especially in task-oriented conversations, but they also use fewer conversational repairs, which might lead us to the speculation that by aligning more inter- and intrapersonally, Danish speakers create a more redundant context, which facilitates each other's speech processing. And preparing the ground for understanding, there is less need for post-hoc repair. Back channels, we have no strong hypothesis as to why there is no difference, but it might simply be that back channels are a very cheap signal that doesn't really ensure that there is shared understanding. There is too little information. You could have me ranting about the Puzzle of Danish on the corridor of IMC, and you really want to get back to your office doing your much more important work, and you just keep on saying, hoping that I just speed through my rant and while you can think about something else. Right? And here, we didn't run any manipulation, though it could have been fun to blast noise to our conversants. So, take-home message. We have that Danish is different, even when using a similar linguistic and cultural baseline as Norwegian Bokmål. In Danish affects cognitive processing, again, in native adult speakers of Danish, where Danes put less weight on the signal and more weight on pre-existing and local information, both at the phoneme word level and at the sentence level. And it's also used differently. Danes create highly redundant contextual niches for top-down inference. They're preparing, they're facilitating each other's work. And that's even more so when the conversation demands precision. And this seems to be not like a huge change in the cognitive system, but more of a set of subtle, flexible cognitive interactional strategies. They're not hard-coded changes. And these might nevertheless have important implications, right? Might have implication for our understanding of language and cognition, where we're moving away from strong universal and more into a vision of the cognitive system as a flexible system that adjusts and optimizes according to the, in this case, linguistic context. But also for our approach to linguistic and social impairment, right? For instance, if Danes are more reliant on the context, how does hearing loss affect them compared to Norwegians? Is this a big enough effect to make a difference? And what about children with linguistic development delays? Could trying to support the context even more strongly or facilitate these sort of strategies help more for Danish children than for Norwegian children? And this could also change our, or help structuring different ways of teaching native speakers and second language learners of Danish, for instance, by providing different ways of scaffolding their learning experience. There's still some hard questions which I'm trying to take away from you. For instance, do cognitive strategies generalize beyond linguistic processing? We've only seen linguistic processing. Do production strategies generalize, for instance, to written language and or fictional conversations like on Danish TV? That is, how are these changes to the strategies employed by the cognitive system like generalizable across context, or how are they very strongly local? Another important question that we haven't really tackled in this project is we can get Norwegians to behave more like Danes, but can we do the opposite? Or is that like a one-way street? Another thing is, if we see that adults are speaking Danish differently to each other than Norwegians do to each other, how do they actually structure the linguistic input for their children? And we have some preliminary, very interesting work by Christina that says they make it even more difficult. But if we wanted also to scale this up, because in a sense, Danish and Norwegian have been our entry in this world of cognitive variability due to the linguistic context, but what are dimensions of systematic linguistic variations that we could use to investigate a larger range of languages, to actually pinpoint more what are the ranges of variability that we can actually see in the way we use our cognitive system. And the very final slide is, this is not just work that contributes to our knowledge or of cognitive science and languages. It's actually created some very concrete products to improve language technologies in about Danish. NLP is natural language processing. We have that all our conversational production has been transcribed, time-coded, and hand-coded. And we have opened it as a data set as part of the GigaWord DK project, which is an attempt at creating a corpus of 1 billion words of Danish to create better products to automatically process Danish. We've also been working with Andreas Kierkedal at ITU, trying to figure out which challenges do these conversations present to the state-of-the-art Danish automated speech recognition, which, thanks to their effort, is gone pretty nicely in naturalistic speech, such as parliamentarian sessions, which is often in NLP considered a very dialogical context, but we actually know that it's just a sequence of monologues, right? And indeed, a system that works very well there doesn't work very well on our conversations, which are produced in a noise-free, nice, quiet environment. But now we have this material and we can actually help getting better tools. We also have extended the alignment Python library to include Danish and Norwegian. And there's going to be also R code to do all these analysis in a as painless way as possible. That will be released with the papers. And there's more work on speech processing tools. I thank you from the whole team.
Thank you, Riccardo. Yes, we are open for questions. By all means, turn on your camera if you are in a space or place where it feels comfortable. It's great to see that there is someone out there. And try raising your hand in the participant window, and I'll try to see the questions as they come up. Yeah. So I thought, Michaela, did you have a question?
Yeah, I do have a question. Thank you, Riccardo. Very nice talk. I had a question about these cognitive strategies that the second language speakers have or might use. Do you have any idea about whether they are flexible over the the lifespan? Is there like a time window where you stop being so flexible into getting all these strategies for learning Danish?
Well, I don't know about learning Danish, but we do see that adult Norwegians in their 20s, they change their processing strategy, right? When we blast noise at them, for instance.
But what do you think will happen for people from other kinds of background languages? Do you think, is there any kinds of difference?
Well, so what I would say is that, so what struck me when learning Danish is that all the focus was, as usual, on learning lexicon and figuring out grammar and maybe learning how to tell a story, and very little on conversations. While we see that the conversation is doing a lot of work to structure the speech processing, right? It's creating a lot of redundancy. And we're very far, or at least I'm very far from having an idea for an intervention, but for instance, putting more focus on these contexts and trying to, in some way, make people aware that, yes, everybody's having issues in parsing that specific word. So what they're doing is they're actually more holistically using the overall information might actually help. But this is far away from even a research question on how to investigate this.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think it's an important question. It's just we're not there.
Other questions? I'm looking for raised hands somewhere.
Hi, Riccardo.
Hi.
Yeah. I was very interested in like learning Danish because that's the same question I have encountered. Like in the Danish school education system, they try to put you in the practice or a context. But actually in like pair learning, like there is somebody who wants to focus on the syntax and grammar. So yeah, actually there's not too much practice on conversation. I'm wondering, like, if you think about like the accent Danish people will have, does this kind of thing will affect their attention on the context or semantic environment? Because I encountered some question like, my Danish teacher told me, oh, you have accent that sounds like you're from Venice, but it's kind of like hard sometimes for people in Aarhus to understand what are you talking. And it's quite different for me to understand people in Aarhus in Copenhagen. So do you think accent will have some kind of effects on attention context?
So this is a good question. So there are anecdotal evidence that, for instance, Danes are good at hearing structured accents from different parts of Denmark, but they're not very good accents. We haven't really tackled this. We had some hypotheses about the precision at which people develop phonological representations of Danish. And Burakan is still working on some experiments that we collected, but we haven't analyzed yet. So there might be something about how precisely you expect sounds to be in a certain way in different languages, right? You might be hyper precise or hypo precise, meaning accepting more, but we haven't really looked at the data, so I have no idea what will come out of that.
But it's quite interesting, like, for example, Norwegian can sound like some kind of like Danish accent. It's kind of like I heard people saying about it's kind of like concentrated in the pronunciation, even sometimes way more than Danish. Yeah, but it's some kind of difference between Danish and Norwegian. But they're all like their origin from the Old Nordics. It's kind of interesting.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, why that changed in different ways, that's also something that would be very interesting to see. Which kind of cultural evolution process pushed these two very different directions is something that we thought a lot about, but we haven't really cracked yet. That's, of course, is a hint for FKK to give us more money.
Yes, James?
Yeah, hi. Thanks for the presentation. It was really, really interesting work. I'm wondering a bit about this this segmentation or lack thereof in Danish, which I found really interesting. And with my experience with Danish speakers, I definitely can see that kind of blurring happening. I'm wondering if you know of research or if you've thought about already other ways that these kind of boundaries might be marked in Danish. For example, with prosodic cues like increased pitch or F0, which we see in Lombard speech, where people will mark the end of content words by a higher pitch, for example, or maybe with multimodal cues such as head nods or co-speech hand gestures that would at least provide some extra structure to the utterance that you might not see then in the speech signal.
Yeah, so it's we've been looking for other examples of phonetically reduced consonants in other languages in the world, and what was always pointed to us was Mandarin, which is compensating with tones, right? In Danish, we actually we haven't looked at multimodal, which is one of the big gaps in this project. So I have a feeling that the prosody is not very helpful, but that's really anecdotal from the outside. So no, but this would be very interesting. It would be extremely interesting also to see how that changes in child-directed speech and adult-directed speech. Because what Christina was seeing in her previous work in child-directed speech is that, for instance, even these many vowels that are presented, they're closer to each other in form and space, so they're harder to parse potentially. And how is these, made it bearable for the children? Are there a lot of other compensatory things like, for instance, in the proxemics or head movements or even the turn taking and timing of the interaction? So there is it's very interesting work by Tanya Stivers who shows that Danish tends to have on average 100 milliseconds longer between turn taking than comparable languages. We don't really see huge differences in our data. I was trying to produce a plot for today's talk, but we see that we can get the same results if we let the results be driven by outliers. So it seems that at least at the very rough level of how long they wait between sentences, it doesn't look different from Norwegian. But yeah, gesture, head movements, prosody would be the next step to look into to figure out how, especially children are parsing the language, but also adults.
Yeah, cool. That would be really nice to see what's going on there. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks for the question.
So Riccardo, you had that very interesting slide where you introduced noise to the system, and you showed that in the pragmatic eras, the Norwegians became, so to say, more Danish than the Danes. For the semantic, it was about the same, and I think for the syntactic, there was less of a difference. And you said you could speculate on why
Yes.
you see this pattern. I would love to hear that speculation.
Okay, let me just find, no, it's not this, it's the previous one. So it's this one, right?
No, I think it was the one that you said it was not that one.
Oh, okay. So
This one, yeah.
yeah, so that would be. So would this be this one about the errors?
Yeah, but whatever. Yeah.
Yeah. So what we see here is that the biases are slightly increased, at least for the semantic bias, and not that much for the pragmatic bias. And we see that. Yeah. No, I can't remember what I meant then.
Maybe the next one, Riccardo.
This one?
I think it was the eye tracking data, right?
Yeah, the eye tracking data.
Okay, because here we see that the so Norwegians are becoming even more attracted, right?
Exactly.
Which I think that, okay, yeah, that part. I think this is super interesting because it might mean that there is an interplay between more like lower level or more hard-coded strategies that Danes are using, and so they can cope with the increase in noise better than Norwegians can. They don't change their strategy too much. You can see that in the two panels, there is not really a lot of difference between how the Danes are looking at drawings in the pragmatic and semantic context. It's just the Norwegians are changing a lot.
Can I add a follow-up?
Yes.
Sorry that my camera isn't working, it's Mikkel. So the one thing I was thinking about when you were talking about the noise study is that, of course, you've been talking about the reductions in consonants.
Mm-hmm.
There's also the added number of vowels. And my question would be, couldn't it be that, so this is the speculative Mikkel talking, that Danes have adapted to noise. We live in a noise environment with lots of trees and seas that make a lot of noise that may resemble the stuff that you threw at them, and that vowels are actually more robust in noise than consonants.
Yeah, so what you might be saying is what we're parsing is not the absence of a sonorous segment, but it's a change in a movement in form and space, right, on the properties of the vowels.
Yeah, so in the context in these stories and the eye tracking, when you add noise to that, it might actually be easier to hear the Danish stories because they're carried to a large extent by vowels. So that's why the Norwegians are responding to the noise, but the Danes are not.
Yeah. Which would, of course, require that we go in and manipulate the, for instance, distance between vowels. Like if we make them more similar to each other.
Yeah, so what I suppose I'm getting at is that the Danish language also has advantages, and this might be one of them. Yes.
So, yeah, we also, there's some side findings that I haven't reported that they're actually better at, they commit fewer errors than Norwegians in this kind of task. So they're, even if they're spending more time looking at the incongruent and implausible scenarios, they end up in absolute choosing the right one better, more often than Norwegian ones do. Which, might be due to chance or might be due to Danish strategies being more able to deal with this contradictory information or with noise in the background. So that would be certainly an interesting angle.
Can I ask one last question? Thank you for the answer. So the point, I suppose, is you're talking about cognitive strategies, but can you, in your results, rule out that there are other additional linguistic differences that you haven't controlled for in this case?
No, we cannot. But yeah, we should definitely get more money and do more experiments. Yes, and this would be obvious. So obvious direction to go. Also because there are other languages where the opposite kind of phonetic reduction is going on. So you have European Portuguese and Brazilian Portuguese, where what's happening is that in European Portuguese you're losing the vowels. Or you're reducing the vowels, and that would make it more interesting to see, like, in which ways does that fail, and in which ways does that make the language more robust.
And we have a really good question from Anna in the chat. Anna, do you want to phrase it yourself?
I haven't opened the chat. I don't know if I have to.
I can read it aloud then. So Anna says, thank you, Riccardo, for the talk. What do you think about voice user interfaces in Danish? Should they be developed with different conversational strategies in mind? For instance, increased alignment? In other words, how to help AI solve the puzzle of Danish through conversational design?
Yes. Well, so one of the things that we don't know yet is what happens if you manipulate that. Right? So would an increased amount of alignment in Danish mean actually that if you reduce the alignment, there is less reciprocal understanding? So that would be something fun to test. Right? I know that there's a lot of work, for instance, at Rutgers by the Reuters on how to integrate conversational repair in these voice user interfaces. I haven't seen much on spoken language and alignment. I've seen a bit on written language, like these avatars that you get on the IKEA website. But yeah, no, it's a super interesting question, and it's something that it would be very interesting to see tested, like how much a change in alignment affect the conversational quality and the understanding of one of the interlocutors, and how much different levels of alignment are perceived in robotic or computer interactant. Yes.
So we've had a number of really bad jokes in the group chat, and all of them are, of course, about generalizing from the language as a medium to what goes on in the mind of people. And you can say they're bad jokes because they all fall out really badly for the Danes. So, like when you speak Danish, you know, you are more repetitive, you're slower, and you would also tend to be less flexible in your cognitive strategy. I guess that's, you know, that's not how we would like to see ourselves. But then, of course, you know, the language as a medium and the persons are not the same. It would be a little bit, or maybe Danish is a little bit like trying to multiply numbers using Roman numbers as opposed to Arabic numbers. It's just a really bad idea or a bad medium to do it in. But just to go back then to this question of cognitive strategies. So do you think that you would actually find any different cognitive strategies outside of the linguistic domain here? Or is this something that's just entirely tied to the specifics of learning this particular medium for communication, just like multiplying in Roman numbers?
Well, so I would love if we saw generalizable effects. Of course, the fact that we don't see very strong effects, for instance, in the errors that Danes and Norwegians make, sort of suggest that these are subtle strategies, which would make me more cautious in expecting to see them. But that's something that we definitely should go and look for, because that's a very important question to figure out. There are these early experiments on very rough collectivist versus individualist societies, trying to argue that, for instance, even the way of exploring visual stimulus changes according to, you know, if you're in a weird society focused on individualism, then you look at the foreground, while if you're in a more collectivist society, you would see a broader pattern of eye movements. These are controversial results, but generally it would be very interesting to see how strongly these biases generalize across domains. It would be weird if they're very local and just for language, or at least a bit disappointing, but that might be the case.
Yeah, I agree. Looking at these classical cross-cultural examinations could be really interesting. And then particularly also if you don't see any effect, right? That it's just something that seems to be tied to language processing and nothing else.
Yeah, that would be, it would be a bit disappointing, but it would be also a very interesting result.
Yeah. Any other questions or comments?
Hi, Riccardo. Can I add something to what Vicky talked about the consonants and vowels before?
Yeah.
I was thinking about maybe I was very interested on like the background noise adding the experiment, and maybe it's because like Danish is kind of like a reduction on the consonants and the vowels are prolonged, and when you're adding noises to the background, and the consonants kind to like disappear or emerge into the background noises, the vowels are kind of be like they're kind of more in a high volume, so you can hear it a little bit clear and kind of compare like this. And maybe there's a possibility, I don't know, maybe Norwegian is not very used to this kind of changing in the different volumes of consonants and vowels, so they kind of like change their habits at the time when you're hearing some noises from the background.
Yeah, so in a sense what you're saying is that the contrast reduction due to the background noise is perceptually more salient in Norwegian because they're not used to this continuous sonorous segment. That could be.
Could
yes.
be. Yeah, I don't know Norwegian much.
Yes, but that's something that we should really think more about in which ways, you know, Danish is actually a source of robustness and which kind of different properties of a noise or a perturbation would sort of disrupt the specific strength of Danish. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Any other questions? So then just before we thank Riccardo, just take a look at the announcements for next week's IMC seminar. It's at 11 o'clock and it's on FNIRS and social development. It's part of this seminar series that explores what you can do with FNIRS. And the talk is given by Antonia Hamilton from UCL. And she is an absolutely amazing speaker. So, you know, even if you don't want to play around with FNIRS, just join the talk just to be updated on how to think about social development these days from one of the best behavioral and developmental psychologists in the world. 11 o'clock next Tuesday, same place in Zoom, we guess. And with that, Riccardo, thanks a lot for a really wonderful, precise and evocative talk.
Thank you.